Welcome. My name is Gail Sunderman, and I want to welcome you today on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Baltimore County to our event with State Superintendent of Education, Mohammed Choudhury. Over the past 2 years, we have sponsored events like this one in an effort to educate and engage with our members, expand the visibility of the League of Women Voters, and hopefully attract new members. So a quick technical note for today. This event is being recorded. Following the speaker, Mara Braverman will moderate the question and answer. So we encourage you to start thinking about questions and type them in the chat function on your screen. I also want to take a minute to recognize you, our audience. Many of you are members of the League, either from the county or from leagues in Maryland or other states. And we are particularly pleased to have many others who are not yet members. If you're not already a member of the League, we encourage you to join. I just put a link in the chat to how to find a local league near you. The League is a nonpartisan grassroots organization. You've probably heard about us and about our work registering voters, promoting voter rights and fair elections, and hosting candidate forums. But we also help our members and communities understand what's happening in local and regional politics. We advocate on issues by contacting elected officials, providing testimony, and through public education and in events like this one. As you know, we have an election coming up this fall. The vote411.org website provides information about candidates and issues that will be on the ballot. Vote 411 is updated before every election. So look for that. The link's also in the chat. It should be updated in Maryland by June 4th. That's vote411.org. It also includes guidance on how to register and locate polling places. So today we are very pleased to have State Superintendent of Education, Mohammed Choudhury. Mr. Choudhury became Maryland State Superintendent of Schools on July 1st, 2021. He is nationally recognized for his work on dismantling inequities in education and narrowing achievement gaps. Before coming to Maryland, Mr. Choudhury was the Associate Superintendent for the San Antonio Independent School District, where he developed a new system to combat inequities. He worked with state legislators and the community in Texas to put in place the funding and structure needed to implement this system, which was successful in boosting the district from one of the lowest performing to the fastest improving district in Texas. Education Week profiled Mr. Choudhury as a leader to learn from and one of 12 exceptional school system leaders recognized for impacting student and teacher success. We are delighted to have you here in Maryland. Please welcome Mr. Choudhury.
Thank you. Thank you for the really nice intro. I really appreciate it. I was actually in Baltimore County all yesterday. I was at Vincent Farms Elementary School. One of the things that I do in the White Marsh area, I believe, I shadow students. And so the way I understand what's happening in our school, I'll spend a day with a student. And so I got to shadow a kindergarten class and also got to see a part of our state that I hadn't been to. So I was in Baltimore County. So that's one of the things that I do. So if you have recommendations of places where I can go shadow students and some of your favorite schools, please do let me know. I really appreciate the time today. I really appreciate you guys just giving me a forum to be able to talk about the department, our work. Maryland is in a really exciting place, a unique place. One of the main reasons I really was attracted to the job is the blueprint for Maryland's future. And so I'm going to spend today's time talking about the blueprint and a specific aspect of the blueprint, because it is truly a law that tries to capture every aspect of the pre-K-12 as well as post-secondary outcomes, whether it be into the workforce right out of high school or more levels of higher education. And so it's no small feat. It's a very big deal. No other state has had a moment where it is putting unprecedented amounts of funding coupled with being able to tackle all of these things all at once. So with that, I'm going to screen share my presentation. So let me switch and get into that mode right quick. And hopefully you guys can all see that. Let me change it to, all right. So if you can see it, please give me a thumbs up so I know it's working. All right, there you go. So with that, I'll jump right in. So I'm going to cover quite a few things, but I'm really going to focus in on how the blueprint is thinking about resource allocation. And so most of my presentation is going to be focused on something called neighborhood indicators of poverty. And it is something that is going to have major implications in terms of how resources are allocated, as well as what they get tied to ultimately to hopefully produce meaningful student outcomes. One of the things the department hasn't been known for is engaging. I've said it and I'll keep saying it. I want to get in trouble for engaging too much. And so I really appreciate you guys inviting me. It's important that the department really step outside of, 200 West Baltimore Street and really is felt across our state, especially in this blueprint era. I often say the department has to be built to be a state education agency for our, what I call the blueprint generation. And so very important to me. And it is a mandate from my bosses, the state board. And so we are working really hard to really break that reputation of the department. The blueprint, as you may already know, has 5 major policy areas from early childhood education with the goal to reach universal pre-K to the greatest amount of possible of high quality full day, half day pre-K, and increase eligibility for scholarships as well, subsidizing, costs, as well as just raising, just the quality across every quarter of our state. It also has a policy area focus on high quality diverse teachers, a major area. You may have seen headlines around the shortage or less people going into the education field. So we're really going to have to get this right. One of those things is raising starting pay for teachers, moving it up to at least $60,000 for starting. That is not true everywhere right now. Some of our school systems are close. Baltimore's county, I believe, is around 54,000. Others are a little bit, but there's a mandate to raise starting pay, as well as create something called a career ladder that enables teachers to both stay in the classroom, but also earn more as well. And then there's a college and career readiness policy area, which is where everything converged. By 10th grade, all students are supposed to be deemed college and career ready, and there will be a definition, a standard around that. Just before this presentation today, I was presenting to the Association of Community College Presidents in Maryland, and so this is an area where they're going to have a lot of focus on. And then there's pieces around governance and accountability, and then finally more resources. So the blueprint has been allocating something called concentration of poverty grants, which enables schools to activate resources and personnel to take a community schools approach and provide wraparound services where needed. And so that's where I'm going to hone in on today. One aspect of the more resources to ensure all students are successful is this notion of being able to measure poverty in more nuanced and in-depth ways. And so today I'm going to talk about what that work entails and where the department is currently, and also give you some examples of this work from my old stomping grounds, as well as some national context as well, and what that looks like. Let's just quickly grounding ourselves on poverty, right? Poverty is multiple things. It is not just how much money you make. It is about social capital, social class. It is, right, I always put this quote in, the extent which an individual does without additional resources or a resource gap. It is about home ownership, right? It's a household composition, the network you have around you, right? We often just, right now in education, we talk about poverty as what you may have heard, farms, free reduced price lunch, or Title I. But poverty is much more than that. And so I'd like to ground ourselves in that. In terms of what the blueprint is hoping to do, right? Why measure poverty in more nuanced ways? Well, it has a lot of high stakes attached to it, right? We allocate financial resources and instructional resources and support resources based on a poverty level of a school. We use it to provide supplemental services, right? We use it to compare outcomes and what outcomes look like and what's going on in this part of our state versus another state. We use it to also report on effectiveness, right? What is this school doing with similar student population that this school is not, but they both have similar demographics, and how can we learn from each other? So it is crucial to make sure we are measuring poverty in nuanced ways. Right now in education, it is limited to something called Title I, as I mentioned. So we like Title I because federal dollars is invested into our education system, but it's really a drop in the bucket when you compare local and state share of piece. It is an important drop in the bucket. I'm coming from a district in San Antonio where it's 90% Title I. Before that, I was in Dallas, and then before that, I was in Los Angeles. And so, and the school system wasn't really reflective of the broader county and the demographics in terms of when you look at wealth and the student population they serve. But we really need to think beyond Title I because there is a growing concentration of poverty and research around the effects of concentrated poverty. And we are actually moving in the wrong direction in the country. There is more and more concentrated poverty in our nation, and Maryland is no stranger to that. And it's happening, especially both within our core in the greater Baltimore region, as well as in as far as regions as west as well as the shore, really. And so we really need to think about when we allocate resources that we don't use just one instrument, which is Title I, to just allocate resources. The depth of poverty factor needs to come into play. And often when you bring in other elements into it, you can start thinking about notions of what one researcher calls the double disadvantage. And so what is the department charged to do? So the department, it actually goes back to House Bill 1206. And I was happy to see this, that the legislator said, hey, we need to look at other sources of poverty and see what that looks like beyond just Title I for schools. And so there was a bill, even before the blueprint bill, saying, hey, look at census tracts and blocks, which I was really excited because this is something I was already doing with my team in Texas. And so it was great to see that the sponsor of that bill was paying attention to those things nationally. So the goal is for the department to begin to convene a work group with our school systems, work with our Maryland Longitudinal Data Center, and essentially begin to pilot an alternative method to both measure poverty and allocate resources. We had an interim report due, that's all public on our blueprint page if you go to the department's website. And then we have a final report that will be due in December of 2022. And ultimately, there will be major implications if you think about going into next legislative session and beyond around evolving how we are measuring poverty and grabbing. And one of the things Maryland recently was able to do is participating with the USDA on something called a Medicaid demonstration pilot, which means that we can direct certify students using Medicaid participation, which will make it further easier to just go ahead and deem what students have high needs and such. And so just to give you an example of an alternative method. This is the report that we published. And again, you can definitely see aspects of this presentation in that report, and you can access it publicly. So I just wanted to call that out. Let me talk about, I'm going to show you some of the initial analysis we've done. And so it's all rooted in the census, and just a quick refresher on the census, right? There's a Lego sitting behind me on my shelf that literally just looks like this. And it's essentially, right, we have our counties, we have our census tracts, we have our blocks, and all of those things say a little more about a community or less about a community. And so we decided to start our analysis at the block level, which is much more closer to the neighborhood level. Maryland has 3,926 blocks, census block groups. Texas, I am forgetting the number, has a lot. It's huge. Maryland has 900,000 students. Texas had 5.5 million children. So just in terms of scale. But one of the things that we did is essentially take our census block data for all 926 and begin to analyze them across 4 factors, or what I call like the base, the foundational analysis that we do, from which other analyses will come. And so the 4 factors are median household income, percent home ownership, percent single parent household, education levels, which is further spliced up by some high school, some college, etc. And essentially you take all those 3,000 plus census blocks that I referred that make up Maryland, and you rack and stack them against each other. And then you take the first 25% and it becomes block 1, the next 25% block 2, block 3, block 4. So the way to think about it is, so this is Maryland's analysis here, is if you are in a tier 5 neighborhood, you are most likely to be making that much in terms of your income. You are less likely to own your home. You're more likely to be in a traditional, non-traditional nuclear household, less likely to be around individuals with higher levels of education. And tier 1 is the highest level. You are more likely to have those income qualities and those socioeconomic status factors. So the key piece here is students growing up in tier 5 neighborhoods, they either have those qualities or are surrounded with individuals with similar qualities versus tier 1 neighborhoods. And we know there's a huge difference around that. There's a huge difference whether growing up in concentrated poverty in parts of Baltimore versus growing up in Columbia or parts of Howard County. There's varying differences, and there's strong research around how it can impact how much lifetime earnings you have, even health outcomes, or how long you live. And so there's also health involved with this. So this is essentially looking at concentrated poverty in a closer level. Let me show you some maps. So I am always fascinated by the maps that come out of this. So this is Maryland, essentially using the 5 tiers. Again, tier 5, low socioeconomic status with those qualities I said. Tier 1, more affluence, more higher levels of socioeconomic status. And so I'm going to zoom in and show you some maps of what our counties look like. But this is just Maryland in terms of using that heat map and the tier methodology. So here's what our school systems look like. So if you look at Baltimore City, right, more than 50% of Baltimore City in terms of the student population, the neighborhood and census block it serves, is in the tier 5 category, right? But the tier 5 category is actually not just in Baltimore City. As you can see, you can go to the shore and see that there are census blocks or neighborhoods where students are residing in concentrated poverty. And then of course you have Howard County, where there is less in terms of the depth of poverty experienced by other places. So just to give you a sense of our 24 school systems, our 23 counties plus Baltimore City, and what that looks like. And so let me take a deeper look at the counties. So here is in terms of adding tier 4 into it, which is also a high depth of poverty as well. So as you can see, several of our school systems, the majority of the student body they serve are in the tier 5 and tier 5 and 4 depth of poverty. And so that comes with that a lot of challenges. That comes with the need for more resources, right? Especially on the wraparound front. That comes with also challenges on teacher recruitment and other things as well. So just giving you a sense of even just using the tier 5 and 4 and how many school systems cross the Maryland average. Here is a look of the maps and the census block. So here's Howard County and Prince George's County. So this is basically showing where tier 5, tier 4 neighborhoods and tier 1 neighborhoods are in the counties and where they are in terms of location. So as you can see, we tend to concentrate poverty in this country. I'm a big housing policy as education policy guy, and we tend to do this. We tend to concentrate poverty, and that I would argue in unhealthy ways. Jim Rouse in Columbia, he wasn't crazy when he was thinking about how to design it, but we didn't necessarily scale that type of thinking. Instead, we concentrated poverty on top of each other, therefore creating challenges. Here's another look at it. Baltimore City, Montgomery County. So as you can see, Baltimore City, remember how I said more than 50% of the census student population it serves are in tier 5 neighborhoods? Here it is. And I can also go back to 1930s homeowners loan corporation maps and show you that it still looks like that in 2022. So not much has changed. So again, just housing policy, education policy is definitely something that continues to persist via generations. And I often like to say, God didn't create these neighborhoods. These are man-made, upheld by policy decisions each and every day. And then there's Montgomery County, as you can see it as pockets of tier 5 and such. Senator Cheryl Kagan was telling me, you see the red over here? I recently was on her podcast. She's like, those are my neighborhoods that I serve and represent in terms of Gaithersburg and such. And so let's talk what you can do with this data. So in around the country, people are beginning to embrace thinking beyond just using Title I or farms or just basing poverty just on income. And so New Mexico, for example, last year passed a law that essentially identified a set of schools that had a high depth of poverty using something called a family income index. And they essentially identified 108 schools that they would allocate an additional $15 million to. So schools got additional dollars ranging as low as $20,000, as high as $434,000. And the funding, they had expectations for it. So they said, you're going to get this funding to help meet additional needs given your depth of poverty, and here's your menu of things you can use that funding for. So here's an example of taking the concept of a more nuanced measure of poverty and applying it in terms of a policy implication. And so in this case, more funding directed at specific schools for specific purposes. One of the other states that did this is Texas, and I'm very proud because this is one of the things that my team gave birth to in Dallas, brought it to San Antonio, and took it to Austin. And I don't call my mom a lot about my work, but I said, Mom, I got Texas to adopt my poverty and so and Texas is very different when you think about politically than Maryland or California, but they adopted this. And so essentially Texas uses the 5-tier methodology using those 4 factors that I mentioned. And they use the methodology to do 2 things. One, allocate more funding. So New Mexico's model was actually built off of Texas's model. And then they do one other thing with it. They also use it to differentiate teacher pay. So if you are a teacher choosing to commit to work in a rural or urban tier 5, tier 4 community, then there are what's something called a teacher incentive allotment that essentially gives you more dollars on top of your base pay, and it's also pensionable, as long as you commit to stay at those schools. So essentially in Texas, you can get an additional $30,000 on top of base pay for committing to teach in rural or areas such as like Baltimore City, as long as you commit and work there. And so big deal. Essentially, it gave those school systems an edge, because what we see, and the research shows, that a lot of veteran teachers or strong teachers tend to avoid our tier 5 areas because they don't want to be a social worker while teaching as well. I often say I was a pretty damn good teacher because I also was a darn good social worker, but that's not a sustainable strategy, right? And so, but this is something Texas did, and I'll give you some examples of how it got applied. So here's an example of comparing Texas to Maryland. Remember the analysis I did of Maryland. So as you can see, Maryland's tier 1 affluence is 158,000. Texas is 102,000. Texas's tier 5 is 28,000, and tier 5 in Maryland is 46. So Maryland is definitely more affluent in terms of a wealthier state. But just to give you a sense of comparison, what it looks like from 2 different states using this analysis. Here is an example of another map. This is my first very heat map I created. This is Dallas. This is Dallas's school system and its boundaries. Look at how the red and green splice up. And literally, again, I can take you back to 1930s redlining, and it looks just like that. You see that white area there? I always like to pick on it. That is Highland Park Independent School District. It is a school district that seceded from Dallas, took its wealth, $1 million homes, 0 poverty. And so essentially, it makes it easy for school system in Texas to necessarily separate. And they use the rest of the city for other services, but for schools, they keep it all separate. And then that airplane is Dallas Love Field, where Southwest Airline headquarters is. And so just to give you an example of another area, I'm gonna shift to San Antonio, where I spent my most recent years in. So San Antonio, one of the good things about Maryland is great things. I would say we have county systems. Some people may not like it, but county systems does at least keep that wealth, right, and for the share of schools you serve versus further segmenting things out. In Bexar County, where San Antonio is, there are 17 school districts within like 25-minute drives from one another. What is pretty crazy, so 17 school boards, 17 superintendents, 17 different procurement processes, etc. And so San Antonio ISD, where I last was, it makes up the core of the district. So you see it's kind of shaped like Texas, but that is San Antonio Independent School District. We make up the core. Look at the demographics of the school district: high poverty, majority minority, predominantly Latino. So this is the last school system where I spent a good chunk of my time in. In terms of what it looks like using the blocks methodology, the tier methodology, here's San Antonio. So not too dissimilar from Baltimore City. Lots of red. Again, the west and east part of San Antonio, I can show you maps on redlining, looks the same. And so this is San Antonio, that core district, in the midst of 16 other districts that surrounded Bexar County. So what does San Antonio look like with its neighboring districts? So here are some of the 17 districts. So as you can see, San Antonio, the vast majority of the kids we served, 82% of them came from tier 5 and 4 neighborhoods. Edgewood ISD, 75% of them, which is a school district to the south of us, smaller, served 75% of students from tier 5. And then you can see more affluent districts. Those are the Northeast, Alamo Heights North Side, shifts the other way. Edgewood ISD is famous for one of our most famous Supreme Court cases, Rodriguez versus San Antonio, that essentially the Supreme Court struck down, saying that educational adequacy is not a right in the country. And so that essentially changed how education is funded in our country. If there's a court case, I wish I could go back and change the decision. This would be one of those that I would share. Here is another look at the county and where San Antonio sits. Notice San Antonio right there in the left part, and then of course the rest of it. What you're seeing in different colors is when I took it statewide, they decided to change the color scheme. So green for more resources, for more money, more funding. They didn't let me keep the red, but the green, the color scheme changed. Notice the bottom part of my slide. Districts received from $3,000 to $32,000 per teacher, depending on the designation designation level, socioeconomic status, and school's location. So it's a big deal. All of a sudden in San Antonio, we had the biggest edge to recruit really game-changing teachers and pay them and create essentially the $100,000 teacher on a more faster pace. And so same thing with our rural counterparts. Here is something that we did in San Antonio called our Master Teacher Initiative. We essentially took those dollars and created something called the Master Teacher Initiative that basically tells teachers, rock star teachers or teachers from out of the state or in state, come to San Antonio. If you're a master teacher, you can get higher levels of pay on top of your base pay if you commit to working in this district. So this is just giving you an example of how it can be applied. So what happened in San Antonio with this, we also used it to bring more equity in our magnet schools. So here is the enrollment of a magnet school, the Advanced Learning Academy. And we made sure that these magnet schools were socioeconomically diverse and integrated. And as you can see, this school is especially diverse and integrated. So the one box in the bottom is school students inside the district who attend the school. And we also have students coming from out of the district because the county is so segregated. In order to introduce socioeconomic diversity in our magnet schools, we would have to open up our borders. And that's what we did. And as you can see, the out of district students tend to skew more affluent, the in district students more tier 5, and they are all attending school in the urban core. Those dots that you see in the north side and black dots that you see that are not in San Antonio's work, those are parents interested in a magnet school from a neighborhood school that may be high performing, but they're interested attending a magnet or a diverse school. And so this is something we also did in addition to our Master Teacher Initiative. Here's what happened in San Antonio as I wrap up. You know, we used to have 35,000 of our students for about 5-6 years ago sitting in Texas's under Texas's accountability list in F-rated schools. And so we have 50,000 kids and 35,000 of them were sitting in the lowest performance. San Antonio was in the bottom of the bottom of the bottom. And here and now going into more recent years, we still have too many, but frankly, it is not 35,000, and the new numbers are actually less than 1,000. And so, and look at the college readiness rate, college going rate. San Antonio, 10% of students were going to college in 2016 who were graduating. When we went through our big transformation, it is now at 68% for Title I students. It is definitely possible to do great things. It takes a lot of work and a lot of commitment. Here's another look at San Antonio's improvement. So Texas has an A through F system, but we became a B district. We began closing the gap. Texas gives you multiple ratings for different domains of the accountability system. And so we were essentially turning the tide and the narrative of what is possible in San Antonio ISD for our children. Lots of work to do, never stop, but it is definitely possible to do great things with students in poverty. With that, my last slide, the State Department of Education and the Maryland State Board of Education are going through a strategic plan. I am changing the department to be built for the blueprint with the state board. We really ask you to fill out this survey and plug it in with all of your networks. We want to get the greatest amount of folks and their perspectives. And so please, please, please share this. And then with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
Thank you very much. Do you want, yeah, that, I'll let you take down your slides.
Yep, there we go.
We want to thank you very much. That was totally fascinating. I'm delighted that you're focusing on this concentration of poverty, because that is a major factor that I don't think a lot of people completely understand the extent of that and how it contributes to educational outcomes. I'm going to turn this over to Mara Braverman, who's going to moderate the question and answer. We are not taking live. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. We did get lots of questions, so Mara, can I turn it over
Yes,
to you?
we have a lot of questions. So
Yeah.
many of our questions follow up on your discussion of concentration of poverty. And so one person raised a concern that per pupil funding in particular school districts can range from, these were the examples, 55% poverty, it'd be 100, at full funding, it'd be $134 per student, but at 85% concentration of poverty, it would be over $3,000.
Mhm.
I mean, if a child lives in poverty, a child lives in poverty.
Mhm.
So how can this kind of unequal funding help all of our students?
Well, there's a foundational base you get if you're just Title I, but a child living in poverty is not the same as a child living in concentrated poverty. The outcomes are a child living in poverty in Howard County has a better shot at making graduating college, living longer, better life outcomes, more likely to be proficient in reading. That's not because of just they're living in poverty. That's because they're not living in, they're less likely to live in concentrated poverty. A child living in Baltimore City, less likely to be proficient, less likely to even live longer, less like growing up in Baltimore City has a negative lifetime impact on your earnings.
Mhm.
So in terms of what is adequate in need and the challenges, yes, the blueprint does bring in a base amount in terms of, and remember, the blueprint is phasing in over a 10-year period. So Maryland's per pupil, just so you know, is going from, it's going to go from being less than 10,000 to hitting over 20,000 by the time we get to 2033, which will make it one of the more highest per pupils in the country. And and then you bring in weights, right? If you're an English language learner, a special education student, etc. So those weights are important. So you may get a weight if you're Title I, but you may get an additional weight when you're Tier 5 and living in concentrated poverty. So because again, what is adequate for that setting and what is needed is what it's trying to get to. But a great question.
Thank you. So another question on the concentration of poverty funding is, someone raised a concern that we have school districts that are have concentration poverty that are urban, like Baltimore City, but we also have some that are quite rural. So, I mean, can we treat both of those types of school districts the same, or will something be done differently?
So the Texas model I gave you was that teacher incentive allotment or that higher weight both acknowledge urban and rural needs. And so there's a way to design these weights and needs, just not looking at a Baltimore City, but also looking at a Somerset, right? There's huge differences between Somerset and Worcester County, right? Worcester County, most of its educational funding comes from local, like over 90%. They have Ocean City. Worcester City, Somerset is the complete opposite, where most of its funding comes from the state, and the needs are different, right? And so I have spent most of my time visiting the West, South, and the Shore before I came back to the core, because I know what's happening in the core. I grew up in the core type districts. I spend most of my time. And so, so yes, that differentiation is key. Rural and urban school districts tend to have the toughest time even recruiting veteran teachers. And again, as I said, there's it's the concentrated poverty element of it as well as other dynamics. So that's a great question.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So we also had a question about how will the blueprint serve poor students who are not in Title I schools? This might be a bit of a repeat of what you told us already, but I want to address it specifically because I think it's an important question.
Yeah, well, remember, the student generates per pupil, right? So if a student is Title I and sitting at, say, Vincent Farms Elementary, where it's 30% farms, or a student who is student who is maybe at a school that is 20% Title I, right? That's not a high poverty school. However, those individual students are generating per pupils and weights, right? And what the blueprint is doing is over a 10-year period is increasing weights. And so it's trying to get at that, it's trying to answer that adequacy question. So you could be a student who is in a more affluent school, but you're living in poverty, or you're not in a, you know, you're not in a majority Title I school, but you might be an English language learner, a Title I student, or you might be a special education. On top of base, you also produce additional weights and funding, and that's supposed to go to the school. So that's how the blueprint envisions serving those students. And there's guardrails in place that school use that money for that kid. So yeah.
Oh, yeah. One of our listeners raised a concern about the reliance on census data, because we know that Maryland has an increasing percentage of its population are actually undocumented families. I mean, it's really been zooming.
That's a great question.
Particularly, and actually, I was surprised to learn recently on the Eastern Shore as well, not just in places like Baltimore. So as a result, is this sort of throwing, for those districts, is this throwing things off, the reliance on census data not fitting the reality of some people not being counted in the census?
So I'm coming from Texas, so I'm well aware of not counting or not necessarily making progressive decisions around, you know, to be able to count people, or even enabling people to vote properly. So trust me, I understand. I'll just say that much. And I would say, on the census front, so that's why we are looking at additional measures such as Medicaid direct certification, right? So the challenge is you can't necessarily pull from all these alternative sources. You have to have some kind of standardized tool or assessment thing that you can pull from. And so the undercount is definitely a concern, but that undercount piece has already been a concern even with the Title I issue. So I'll give you an example. Baltimore City, its Title I percentage has actually been going down. Well, why is that happening? It's not because more affluence is moving in, it's because as it's moved to universal free lunches, there's a less reliance on these forms. There's something called community eligibility provision. It's great for feeding everyone, which we all want, because a hungry child's not going to learn, but it has thrown off the numbers because no one's filling out the form. So one of the things in the blueprint that they're asking for is a unified state form that we can introduce to be able to bring a more accurate count. So that's something you can do. But the last thing I will say about the census, because we are so segregated and housing is so concentrated, the tier 5 4 neighbors are not necessarily changing. Even if you undercounted, you would still get that school more resources than you would on the Title I methodology because of the concentration of poverty of all the other students. And again, what you do is once you get there, you also make up for it with introducing another way to capture, say, the undocumented population. Medicaid using direct Medicaid certification is one approach, and we're building the infrastructure for that now.
Okay. So switching gears from concentrated poverty, we have a question. 3 big challenges many schools face are social, emotional well-being, classroom management, and teacher turnover, which you discussed a little bit before, and that collectively these lead to disciplinary actions that disproportionately affect children of color. Evidence shows that well-implemented restorative practices address these issues powerfully. What is your view of restorative practices, or are there other strategies you think better suited for Maryland schools?
Yeah, so you're talking to a former associate assistant superintendent of 2 districts that banned suspension other than for very aggressive or violent issues. So we banned suspension, and we decided to take a whole restorative approach. In Texas, we also convinced the Texas legislature to ban suspension in pre-K through 3rd grade as well too, because that was also something that and there was huge bipartisan support for that. So restorative discipline, restorative approach, it is definitely the right direction. However, we have to remember that our school systems and teachers haven't been necessarily groomed to this approach, right? And so when we took away suspension, right, some people, including principals, said, "You're taking away my tool. You're taking a tool away from me." And so, well, your tool has not been working, and you use it way too many times. So while you do shift to restorative discipline, it's very important that the professional development and other pieces come with it, because otherwise you could end up having a phenomenon where kids are not necessarily being suspended, but they're just being put in another room. And so, those are some things to do it. But in terms of the state superintendent's view on restorative discipline and practices, it is definitely the right approach. I mean, it's a practice that was actually groomed in our prison system, right? And seeing better outcomes and lower rates of recidivism. And so I am a fan of it, but you gotta do it really well in terms of implementation.
So do you think that, I mean, obviously, local districts have to commit to this? Is MSDE working with districts to try to encourage them to adopt restorative practices?
So Maryland has some things that are already passed, like you cannot suspend in, say, the lower grades, right? That's been banned. But in terms of the education code, there has been a more shift towards pushing towards restorative discipline. Are we there yet? No, we're not, right? As I've been auditing the department and the work to done, we still have high rates of suspension, especially for our Black boys throughout our state. And that's still a problem. I can even show you arrest data that is disproportionately, and it's not working. And so will I say that, you know, we're where we need to be? No, we're not. Is the department going to push hard as this being a priority? Absolutely. But you're going to have to make sure the resources there and things like that. So yeah. I'll give you one example. School systems can suspend a kid for something called willful defiance. Well, the question is, what is willful defiance? Well, we have 24 definitions of willful defiance. It could be as my head's on the desk and I'm saying, no, you're get out of here, you're suspended, you know. It is absolutely ridiculous. So one of the things this work requires is rubbing up against, and I know Maryland likes this word, local control, and rubbing up against that tension. And so I won't be shy about that. As I told the superintendents, you can't use local control against me all the time. That's not going to work.
So we have a question, another question. Some students have been pushed through the educational system without the ability to read, write, comprehend, and compute. And the pandemic, of course, made this all worse. But let's face it, there were children who were had learning deficits before the pandemic. What steps are being taken to help these students? Will summer schools be available this year for those who are behind? Are we going to be having any one-on-one tutoring, which we know is the gold standard for helping kids learn to read?
Absolutely.
And also, and this really kind of goes with the two, for the older students, how do we motivate those students who've really kind of given up on the idea of school being a great idea for them? You know, they have trouble picturing how school will help them to have a better life.
Got it. You guys are asking all of the deep philosophical questions today. So I would say, let's start with reading. We as a country, but also as a state, are still not ensuring the scientific-based reading methodology being true in all of our schools. There was a time in our country where we emphasized phonics, and then we shifted to something called, reading got caught up in the culture wars, and we went to whole language. And then we called something balanced literacy, but it was really whole language in disguise. And now the science of reading is making a comeback. And so many states have passed legislation mandating, requiring this. Maryland isn't there yet. However, I recently put out a major grant initiative, essentially challenging the school systems to adopt science of reading approaches. And I want to see if they take the challenge. And if they don't take the challenge that way, then I'm going to think about legislation because I'll give you an example of a state that often people like to say, at least we're not them. Mississippi. people often say, at least we're not Mississippi. Well, guess what? Mississippi's reading outcomes on the NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, our nation's report card, is now in the middle of the pack. They're in Maryland's league, and some student subgroups are performing better. They shifted towards Mississippi doesn't do a whole other things well when it comes to child well-being, but the fact that that shift and you see them spike up. And so we have work to do there. So let's start with early reading at the 3rd grade level, because once you can't read at that level, reading to learn and reading to write as well as to read, right? Those things matter. And then comes all the interventions if you're not. So that's one shift that we need to make. In terms of students.
Let me just interrupt you for a second, because I think some people are confused about when you say the science of reading, is that actual, or the scientific, agreement, is that really saying we should be using phonics? Just use phonics as instruction?
It is settled science that explicit, direct scientific instruction on phonics in the early grades is the best way to teach.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. But that's not happening. Some folks still have the belief, including in our institutions of higher ed, by the way, preparing future teachers, that kids learn words by looking at pictures, or it just naturally happens. No, it is not a natural process. It is a process that takes explicit instruction, and it's going to take a retraining, right? In Texas, it took a retraining. We have veteran teachers who, they're like, I did not know this, or this is not the curriculum I was provided. This is not our school system. So that's on the reading front. There was a lot in that question. So the other on this older students who have been disengaged and such, one of the things that has made a rightful comeback, and the blueprint does put a right priority, is on career technical education. And not everyone needs to go to college to make a well-paying job or experience economic mobility in their life. So, and frankly, there was a time when we had an emphasis on CTE, and then a huge emphasis on college kind of shifted the country away from that. And now we're coming back full circle saying, hey, that thing called CTE, we need to be doing this. So one of the things the blueprint is really big on is scaling apprenticeships. And it really looked at Switzerland, the VET model, right? By their equivalent of 10th grade, students choose either a pathway, they choose one of 3 pathways. They choose to go into higher ed, and they're more advanced and they want to get a 4-year degree, or they choose to go to some combination of higher ed and a workforce outcomes, but maybe for 2 years, or they jump into the workforce. And so that goal, that policy area CCR, that standard, and you can invite me back, I can talk about that policy area. The goal is for students by the end of 10th grade to figure out what they want to do. And if it's a workforce outcome, then let's focus on that. So for those disengaged students, right, I don't want them to drop out. Right? I still want them to be able to be anchored in learning. I also don't want them to become undercredited and overage. But if the workforce is something that they're interested in, then let's make sure we build that bridge and connection for our students. So those are some things that we would utilize.
So we also had a question come in advance about the 5-star rating system that Maryland uses, which I know is meeting the federal requirement about school performance. And the person who submitted the question wrote, the ratings conflate the data, making them a blunt approach to judging school success that can fail to recognize outstanding instruction and academic gains, particularly in schools serving low-income and minority students. So how does MSDE use these report card ratings, and what actions has it taken to determine if the 5-star system could provide more complete information about individual school performance?
Great question. We're asking about accountability systems now. And so this is also a heavy topic. Maryland's system was developed as part of the, we went from the No Child Left Behind Act to the Every Student Succeeds Act, the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Act. And one of those things was for people to revamp their accountability systems. So Maryland's system, right, I am currently doing an audit of it. I'm 8 months in. It is going to go through an evolution as part of Blueprint. So as part of Blueprint, it does need some upgrades. There is also legislation that was put in a few years ago, and there was tensions between the governor and the assembly. It was called the Protect Our Schools Act by the legislature that essentially wanted to limit what can be put into the system. And then the governor came back with a Protect Our Students Act because he felt like it was not looking at student outcomes accurately. So I will say this on this topic. The most powerful measure of accountability is growth. You look at if a school is growing students from the baselines that they have, right? We have schools that may be highly affluent, are rated 5, but they're actually not growing schools. But guess what? Families still go to those schools because, right, it's the socioeconomic status of that school tends to track with proficiency. But there are schools that are growing kids 5, 6, 7 levels, but you need a very nuanced and more finite, also taking into whole child metrics and context, a growth measure to really look at that accountability. San Antonio ISD, 90% Title I, 90% Title I, and you saw that red. Right. I don't like the Texas A through F labels, but the one progressive element in that is they give you the best of proficiency or the best of growth. And our growth is off the charts. Right. And so that growth enabled us to go from an F to a B and such. And so I'll just put it that way. It is a complex topic. The one thing I am not for is before No Child Left Behind, we were in the dark about what the gaps were. We were every school system had all kinds of different versions of assessments, and we were in the dark about measuring the gap, because the achievement gap to me is not a measure of just learning gap, but it's also a measure of an opportunity gap, right? And so we need to build that with additional resources and need. So I'm not for going in the dark. However, I am for making it and refining it and emphasizing growth more than proficiency. And so that's how I would answer that question.
Okay. So we've had some questions about increasing diversity among teachers and school administrators, which unfortunately, it's a long-standing problem in many of our schools. It's only gotten worse. So what is there anything that MSDE is doing or plans to do that will help the local districts that are struggling to increase the diversity?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And it's also a Blueprint focus area. I'm going to put in the chat right quick the major grant initiative we recently put out. It's called Maryland Leads. And it's something that we're using our federal ESSER dollars for. And essentially one of the priority areas for there is something called a grow your own strategy. We're not going to diversify the teaching profession overnight. There's a lot of factors that go into it. Last night, I actually did a teacher diversity roundtable with our with Black and Brown teachers from across the state, and our Maryland State Teacher of the Year, Brianna Ross from Baltimore County, helped me facilitate it. And we talked about what it's going to take to diversify the profession. And so one of the key strategies is grow your own. So essentially get our high school students, get our interested into teaching and wanting to teach. And so, and get them hooked early on, get them into a program, have them start, learning about pedagogy and such as they're going into the later years of high school, and then have them seamlessly jump into an institution of higher ed, and then bring them back to your local school system and hire them. And so we've done grow your own strategies in Dallas and San Antonio. It's a, if you just type in grow your own education or grow your own teachers, you're going to see it's a national movement. And so Maryland hasn't scaled it from the state level. And so that's something I'm going to do. So that's one way to diversify. And the way you design them is it's a cohort-based model. You identify a cohort, you try as much as possible to subsidize their education, like the debt and things like that, because frankly, teachers are not going into the profession making a lot in the early years. So one of the things is subsidize their debt through the program. And then the other hook is, let's guarantee you a position. So if you finish, we will subsidize your debt, we will guarantee you a job. And if you commit for 3 years or 5 years, then we'll help pay off your debt or minimize it. So those programs are making a difference. We had a teacher from Howard County who went through a Grow Your Own program that Howard County did in partnership with McDaniel College. And so let's start there. So that's one piece. The other piece I would say is other things as well, and just how complicated it is to become a teacher, right? What kind of hoops or things that we have? Are we measuring the right things? Or are we just putting all kinds of licensure exams in the way that are making people stumble and such? And so those are some things as well. I'll give you one fact: 50% of the Maryland teacher population we import in from outside of our state. That's how much we are dependent on out-of-state teachers.
Wow.
50%. And so, but that's one way to diversify the profession. So I'll just stop there for that.
Wow. So we had questions from a number of people. Do we have time to take one more question?
Yes, I have one question that I do
Oh,
want to ask.
wait, excuse me. Wait. Do we have time to ask one more question, Superintendent?
Sure.
Okay. Several parents sent in questions about the updated health curriculum for pre-K through 3rd grade, about gender identity and transgenderism using sexually explicit material. Parents are concerned about, given the young age of these students, that they don't have the ability to opt their children out or to even view the lessons that are being taught. So the questions are, what is the purpose of these topics with young children, and why is MSDE not allowing parents to have a say on such a sensitive and controversial topic?
Yes, it is, but it is also not. Maryland's health standards are aligned to national standards, and some of the claims being made of what is being taught is frankly just not true. And if people want to opt out, they can. Local school systems allow students to opt out of the certain curriculum, and they can opt out of the health curriculum. Maryland's health standards are built off of legislation that was passed going back to before 2019, and it was developed with a broad section of stakeholders, including Maryland Department of Health. And what is being taught in pre-K through 3 deals with learning about different family types and understanding that there are different families, right? And so that is not something that should be controversial. Frankly, I'm just gonna say it that way, right? It is not controversial to know that there are different family types in our country. And so if a family member wants to opt their kid out of that, then they can. They have to use the local school system procedure. But the standard itself and the framework itself, it is up to standard. It is up to what students need to know and be able to do and understand at that grade level and beyond. And so I understand, trust me, my inbox is a busy inbox, but it is not something I will say that Maryland has made the wrong move on. And frankly, there's a lot of myths out to what's being said around this, so.
Okay, I'm just going to close with one topic that's on the minds of many of us these days, and that's civic education. We had quite a few questions related to that. Will civic education be infused into the curriculum, multiple grades? I mean, how is civic education being handled in Maryland?
So civic education is, so we do have a framework for civics education. Is it something that is like a essential element that you must get it across? It's more like an add-on. right? So I think that's the piece. There's a framework, right? We have a lot of instructional frameworks, such as the health framework and other things. And so school systems can embed civics, right? Maryland Social Studies curriculum is actually one that is nationally recognized, and we have been recognized multiple times in terms of how we have framed our social and the type of critical thinkers and how we educate students about democracy. We've been recognized multiple times nationally around this. But on the civics piece, in terms of like explicit focus on it, the notion is that it's embedded, but not necessarily a standalone kind of milestone experience. So I understand that it is a crucial piece, part of a participatory democracy. The question is it best done as embedded, or is this best done as like some kind of mandated course? And I can tell you, once you start that, everyone wants a course. Everyone wants a financial literacy course and this and that. So at a certain point, okay, what can students fit into their schedule, and what does that look like? And so, but it is definitely an important element of our education system, and we should definitely continue to push to have it embedded. I tend to take the embedded approach versus just create a standalone course. Students should experience versions of it at various points in their pre-K 12 experience. Yeah.
Okay, well, we do have more questions, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So thank you to everyone who sent questions in ahead or asked them in the chat. And thank you, Superintendent, very much for your highly informing presentation.
Yes, I would also like to thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and I must say I'm encouraged and excited that you're here, and we look forward to meeting with or working with you on education issues. To our audience, I just want to say thank you for joining us today, and please remember to join a local league near you. This is our last event for now. We're taking a break over the summer to assess how we may proceed. And we want to thank everyone who has attended and supported these events since we started them, and for joining us today. So again, thank you for attending, and thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation.